The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the general store, kicking up a cloud of Kansas dust that settled on Eleanor Hartwell's already stained traveling dress. She stepped down onto the wooden boardwalk, her fingers clutching the worn carpet bag that contained everything she owned in this world. 3 dresses, a hairbrush, her mother's Bible, and a daguerreotype of parents she'd never see again. The September sun beat down mercilessly on the town of Redemption Flats, and Eleanor felt the weight of 50 curious eyes upon her as townspeople paused their business to stare at the mail-order bride who'd just arrived. She'd promised herself she wouldn't cry. Not here, not in front of strangers. But as she looked down the dusty street at the ramshackle buildings and hard-faced men loitering outside the saloon, Eleanor felt her resolve crumbling. What had she done? Trading one prison for another, fleeing her stepfather's cruelty in Boston, only to bind herself to a man she'd never met. A rancher named Caleb Stone, who'd answered her advertisement with 3 terse letters describing his property, his need for a wife, and his promise of fair treatment and a roof overhead. Not love, not even kindness, just survival. Before we continue with Eleanor's journey, I'd love to take a moment to ask you something. If you're enjoying this story, would you consider subscribing to the From Wild West channel and giving this video a like? It truly means the world to us and motivates us to bring you more quality content like this. Also, I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? Are you at home, on a drive, or perhaps while you're working? I'd love to know. Now, back to Eleanor's story. Mrs. Stone. A gruff voice pulled her from her spiraling thoughts. Eleanor turned to find a weathered man with silver-streaked hair and a marshal's badge pinned to his vest. His eyes were kind, despite the harsh lines carved into his face by sun and hardship. "Miss Hartwell," she corrected quietly, "until the ceremony." The marshal's expression softened with something that looked dangerously like pity. "I'm Marshal Tucker. I'm afraid I have some difficult news, miss. Caleb Stone. He passed 3 days ago. Horse threw him on the trail, broke his neck." The world tilted. Eleanor's hand shot out to grip the porch post, her knuckles white against the weathered wood. Dead. The man she'd traveled 1,500 miles to marry was dead, and she was alone in a town where she knew no one, with $17 to her name and nowhere to go. "I'm so sorry," Marshal Tucker continued, his voice gentle. "The Reverend's wife might have room if you need a place until you can arrange passage back east." "I can't go back." The words came out sharper than she intended. Eleanor forced herself to breathe, to think. "My stepfather. I can't go back." Understanding flickered across the marshal's weathered face. He'd seen enough desperate women in his years to recognize one running from something worse than an uncertain future. "The Stone Ranch still stands," he said carefully. "Caleb had a foreman, Will Garrett. Good man. Been running the spread for near about 8 years. He could use some help, seeing as how he's trying to manage it alone now." He paused, measuring his words. "Kitchen work, washing, that sort of thing. Decent pay in a separate cabin, all proper-like." Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. What choice did she have? The ride to the Stone Ranch took nearly 2 hours, the buckboard rattling over rutted trails that cut through endless prairie grass turned gold by late summer. Marshal Tucker kept up a steady stream of conversation about the town, the ranch, and Will Garrett. Quiet sort, but honest. Never known him to treat a soul unfairly. Eleanor barely heard him. She was too busy cataloging her dwindling options, each one bleaker than the last. The ranch appeared as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. It was larger than she'd expected. A sturdy main house of weathered timber, a barn that looked newly repaired, corrals containing perhaps 24 horses, and a smaller cabin set back among a grove of cottonwood trees. Smoke rose from the main house's chimney, and Eleanor could see a figure moving in the yard, carrying water buckets from the well. He straightened as the buckboard approached, setting down the buckets with careful precision. Even from a distance, Eleanor could see he was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. He wore simple clothes, worn denims, a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, scuffed boots. But it was his face that caught her attention as they drew closer. Strong features, a jaw dark with several days' stubble, and eyes of such startling green they seemed to capture the prairie itself. "Will?" Marshal Tucker called out as he pulled the horses to a stop. "Brought someone who could help you out here." Will Garrett's gaze moved to Eleanor, and she felt the weight of his assessment. Not lecherous or crude, but careful. As if he were examining a horse he might purchase and wanted to ensure it hadn't been mistreated. His eyes lingered on the bruise she'd tried to hide beneath powder. 3 weeks old now, but still faintly visible on her cheekbone where her stepfather's ring had split the skin. Something flickered in those green eyes. Anger, quickly controlled. "Miss," he said, his voice low and rough as creek gravel. He moved forward to offer his hand to help her down from the buckboard, and Eleanor noticed the calluses, the old scars across his knuckles, the strength in his grip tempered by unexpected gentleness. Marshal Tucker explained the situation quickly. Caleb's death, Eleanor's circumstances, his suggestion that she might work at the ranch. Will listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. "I can cook," Eleanor said when the marshal finished, hating the desperation she heard in her own voice. "And clean, mend clothes, tend a garden. I'm a hard worker, Mr. Garrett. I won't be a burden." "I'm sure you won't." Will's eyes met hers directly, and Eleanor found she couldn't look away. "But I need to be clear about something, Miss Hartwell. This is a working ranch. Days start before dawn and end after dark. The work is hard, and there's plenty of it. I can pay you $15 a month, plus room and board. The small cabin's yours. It's got a good stove, solid roof, proper door with a lock. You'll have your privacy." He paused, and something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I won't make promises I can't keep, and I won't expect anything from you that we don't agree on straight and clear. You'll be treated with respect here, or you won't stay. Your choice, always your choice. Understood?" Eleanor felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. "Understood. Then welcome to the Stone Ranch, Miss Hartwell." The first week passed in a blur of exhausting work and cautious observation. Eleanor rose each morning while stars still glittered in the vast prairie sky, lit the stove in her small cabin, and made her way to the main house to prepare breakfast. Will was always already awake, usually returning from checking the horses or mending fence in the pre-dawn darkness. They ate together in companionable silence, eggs, bacon when they had it, biscuits she learned to make from the sourdough starter she found in the pantry. He never pressed her for conversation, never asked invasive questions about her past, but she found herself watching him as he worked, noting the careful way he handled the horses, the patience he showed with a skittish colt in the breaking pen, the gentleness in his scarred hands as he tended a mare who'd cut her leg on wire fencing. "You're good with them," she observed one afternoon, bringing him water while he worked with a young stallion in the corral. Will glanced up, surprise flickering across his features, as if he weren't accustomed to compliments. "Horses are honest. They don't lie about what they feel or what they need. Treat them fair and they'll trust you. Hurt them and they'll remember forever." He stroked the stallion's neck, and the animal leaned into his touch. "Not so different from people, I suppose." Eleanor thought about that as she returned to the house, about trust and memory and the scars that didn't always show. It was during her second week that everything changed. She'd been carrying wash water from the well, struggling with the heavy buckets, when her foot caught on a root and she went down hard. Water soaked her dress. Pain shot through her twisted ankle, and before she could stop them, tears of frustration and exhaustion spilled down her cheeks. "Let me see." Will was there instantly, crouching beside her in the mud. His hands hovered near her ankle, not touching without permission. "May I?" Eleanor nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. His touch was impossibly gentle as he examined her ankle, his fingers careful against the swelling. "Not broken, but you've wrenched it good. Can you stand?" "I can," she began, trying to push herself up, but Will was already moving, sliding one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back. "Go slow," he said quietly, as he lifted her. "It hurts, I know." And there it was, the phrase she'd read in his letters to Caleb, words she'd dismissed as mere pleasantry. But hearing them now, feeling the careful strength in his arms as he carried her toward her cabin, Eleanor understood they meant something more. He settled her on the narrow bed, propped her foot on a pillow, and disappeared. She heard him moving around the main house, and then he returned with strips of cloth and a basin of cold water from the well. "This'll help with the swelling." He wrapped the cold compress around her ankle with the same careful precision she'd seen him use with the horses. "You should rest it for a few days." "I can't," Eleanor protested. "The work will keep." His green eyes met hers, firm but not unkind. "I managed before you came, Miss Hardwell. I'll manage a few more days while you heal." "Eleanor." The words slipped out before she could stop it. "Please, just Eleanor." Something shifted in his expression, softening the hard lines around his mouth. "Eleanor, then, and I'm Will, just Will." He brought her meals for the next 3 days, sat with her in the evenings while the light faded, teaching her to play checkers with a set carved from cottonwood. They talked, carefully at first, testing the boundaries of shared confidence. She told him about her mother's death from consumption, her father's grief that had drowned in whiskey, her stepfather's cruelty disguised as discipline. "He said I was worthless," she whispered, one evening, staring at the checkerboard without seeing it. "That no man would want me except as unpaid labor. That I should be grateful he didn't throw me into the streets." Will was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and intense. He was wrong. "You're not property, Eleanor. You're a person, one worth knowing." Their eyes met across the small table, and Eleanor felt her breath catch. In the lamplight, with shadows softening his hard features, Will Garrett looked like a man carrying his own weight of secrets and sorrows. "Why did you stay here?" she asked. "After Caleb died, you could have moved on, found another job." Will's jaw tightened. "Made a promise 8 years ago to a woman who showed me kindness when I had nothing. She made me swear I'd look after her son if anything happened to her. Caleb was difficult, But I kept my word. She must have meant a great deal to you. Sarah Stone saved my life. The words came out rough, painful. Found me half dead on her property, gut shot, and left to die by men I'd called friends. Outlaws who decided I was a liability when I wanted out of the life. Sarah nursed me back to health, never asked questions, never judged. When she got the fever that took her, I swore I'd protect what mattered to her, even after she was gone. Eleanor reached across the table, her hand covering his. His skin was warm, the calluses rough against her palm. You're a good man, Will Garrett. He turned his hand over, his fingers curling gently around hers. I'm trying to be. By the end of her third week at the ranch, Eleanor's ankle had healed, and she'd fallen into an easy rhythm with Will. They worked side by side, her managing the house and garden, him handling the horses and livestock. But their evenings had become something more. Hours spent talking on the porch as twilight painted the prairie purple. We're sitting together in comfortable silence while she mended shirts and he oiled tack. She learned that he loved storms, the way they rolled across the open land with a fury that somehow brought peace. That he'd been born in Missouri, orphaned at 12, and spent his teenage years making bad choices before Sarah Stone had given him a reason to change. That he'd sworn never to let himself care deeply for anyone again, because the pain of losing them was too great. Eleanor understood that last part. She'd made the mail-order bride swore she'd never love him, a promise to herself during those long weeks of travel. Love meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain. She'd seen what her mother's love for her father had cost, watched it drain the life from her when he'd turned to the bottle. Better to keep her heart locked away, safe behind walls no one could breach. But Will Garrett was dismantling those walls stone by stone, with every kindness, every careful touch, every moment of unguarded honesty. The trouble came on a Tuesday morning in early October. Eleanor was hanging laundry when she heard the horses, 3 riders approaching fast from the east. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun, and felt ice slide down her spine. She knew that carriage, recognized the silver-trimmed harness on the lead horse. Her stepfather. Eleanor! Charles Hartwell's voice carried across the yard, sharp with authority and barely controlled rage. Eleanor Rose Hartwell, come here this instant. She stood frozen, wet sheets forgotten in her hands, as the 3 men dismounted. Charles Hartwell was a prosperous merchant in Boston, impeccably dressed, even now in traveling clothes, his iron gray hair perfectly groomed. The 2 men with him were hired muscle, their intent clear in the way they flanked him like well-trained dogs. I should have known I'd find you in a place like this. Charles's lip curled in disgust as he surveyed the ranch. Whoring yourself to some cowboy in the middle of nowhere. Do you have any idea the embarrassment you've caused me? The scandal? I'm not... Eleanor's voice shook, and she hated herself for it. I'm working here, honestly employed. Honestly? Charles laughed, the sound cruel. You're a thief, Eleanor. You took money from my desk, clothes that I paid for. You'll return with me now, face the consequences of your actions. I'm not going anywhere with you. Eleanor forced her spine straight, her chin up. I'm 22 years old. I have a right to my own life. Charles moved so fast she didn't see it coming. His hand cracked across her face. The same vicious backhand she'd endured countless times in Boston. Eleanor stumbled, tasted blood, felt the old fear trying to drown her. You have only the rights I allow you, girl. Now get! Touch her again! A low voice said from behind Eleanor, and it'll be the last thing you do. Will stood 15 feet away, his hand resting easy on the revolver at his hip. He must have come from the barn, drawn by the commotion. His expression was carved from stone, his green eyes glacial with controlled fury. Charles assessed Will with the contempt of a man accustomed to buying his way through obstacles. "This doesn't concern you, cowboy. This is family business. Eleanor is under my protection." Will's voice was quiet, deadly. "That makes it my business. I'm asking you once, politely, to leave my property. Don't make me ask twice." "Your protection?" Charles sneered. "You think I'm afraid of some rant hand with a gun? I have the law on my side. She's my stepdaughter, and she's stolen from me. I have every right to take her back. She's a grown woman who left of her own will." Will hadn't moved, but something in his stance had shifted, coiling like a rattlesnake preparing to strike. "And I'm not just some ranch hand. Name's Will Garrett. Perhaps you've heard it?" The color drained from Charles's face. Clearly, he had heard the name, likely the stories from 10 years ago. When Will had ridden with the Blackwood gang before, Sarah Stone had saved him. Before he'd turned his life around. "You're an outlaw," Charles breathed. "Was," Will's voice hardened. "Was an outlaw. Now I'm a man trying to live right and protect someone who deserves protecting. You can leave peacefully, or I can make you leave. Your choice." For a long moment, silence stretched across the yard. Then Charles's hand moved toward his coat, and everything happened at once. Will's gun cleared leather with practiced speed, the hammer clicking back. One of Charles's hired men reached for his own weapon, and Eleanor, without thinking, threw herself between Will and her stepfather, her arms spread wide. "No," she screamed. "No more violence. I won't have bloodshed because of me." Will's aim never wavered, but his eyes flickered to her face. "Eleanor, move." "I won't." She was shaking, terrified, but she held her ground. "I won't let you kill for me. I won't let him make you into something you're not anymore." For 3 heartbeats, the world balanced on a knife's edge. Then Marshal Tucker's voice cut through the tension. "Everyone, lower your weapons. Now!" The marshal had ridden up unnoticed, his own gun drawn, his weathered face grim. "Charles Hartwell, I received a telegram from Boston. Seems there's questions about missing funds from several accounts you managed. Federal Marshal's been asking after you. Funny how that works. You come here making accusations, but turns out you're the thief." Charles went still as stone. "I'm escorting you back to face those questions," Tucker continued. "Your men can leave or join you, their choice. But you won't be taking Miss Hartwell anywhere except in your nightmares." As Tucker led Charles and his hired men away, the latter having wisely chosen to depart rather than face federal charges, Eleanor felt her legs give out. Will caught her before she hit the ground, his arms strong and sure around her. "I've got you," he murmured against her hair. "You're safe now. I promise you're safe." She clung to him, her face pressed against his chest, feeling the solid reality of his heartbeat beneath her cheek. "I'm so afraid you'd kill him, that you'd ruin everything you've built because of me. Eleanor." Will pulled back just enough to cup her face in his hands, his thumbs gentle against her tear-stained cheeks. His eyes searched hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "Don't you understand yet? I'd have faced down hell itself to keep you safe. I'd face down my own past, my own demons. Because somewhere between your first burned iskets and teaching you to play checkers, somewhere between your stubbornness and your courage, I stopped trying to keep my heart safe." "Will, I love you," he said simply, the words rough but certain as bedrock. I know I swore I'd never let myself feel this again. I know you made your own promises about not loving. But I'm a man who's learned that some oaths are meant to be broken, and I'm breaking mine right now. I love you, Eleanor Hartwell. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you see past what I was to what I'm trying to become. Eleanor felt something crack wide open in her chest. Years of careful protection shattering like glass. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "I know." Will's thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, avoiding the bruise that was already forming from Charles's blow. "But I'll die before I hurt you." That's not a pretty promise, Eleanor. That's the raw truth of it. Whatever this is between us, we'll face it together. Together. The word resonated through her like a bell. "I love you too," she breathed, and watched wonder bloom across his hard features. "God help me, Will Garrett. I do." The kiss was inevitable, gentle as spring rain. His lips were warm against hers, his hands cradling her face with that same careful strength she'd come to treasure. Eleanor's fingers curled into his shirt, holding on, claiming this moment and this man as her own. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Will rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "Not because you need protecting or a roof over your head. Marry me because I want to wake up next to you for the rest of my life. Because I want to build something real with you, something that's ours." "Yes," Eleanor said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were married 3 days later in the small church in Redemption Flats, with Marshall Tucker standing up as witness and half the town crowding into the pews. Eleanor wore a simple blue dress that the Reverend's wife had helped her make, her hair braided with late autumn wildflowers that Will had picked that morning. He wore his best shirt, his dark hair still damp from the trough, looking more nervous than she'd ever seen him. When Reverend Matthews asked if there were any objections, Will glanced at Eleanor with such raw hope in his green eyes that she felt her heart might burst. "I do," she said firmly when her turn came, and watched his shoulders ease with relief. "I do," he echoed, his voice carrying to every corner of the church. And then he was kissing her, properly kissing her, while the congregation cheered and whistled. The wedding supper was held at the ranch, with neighbors bringing food and music and laughter, as twilight painted the prairie in shades of gold and violet. Will led Eleanor away from the celebration to the small rise behind the house, where they could see for miles in every direction. "I have something for you," he said, pulling a small bundle from his pocket. "It's not much, but—" Eleanor unwrapped the cloth to find a ring carved from dark wood, polished smooth and inlaid with a sliver of turquoise. "Will, it's beautiful. Cottonwood from that grove near your cabin," he explained, suddenly shy. "Stone from the creek bed. I know it's not gold or silver. It's perfect." She held out her hand, and he slipped it onto her finger. "Because it's from you. Because it's real and honest and made with your own hands, just like everything you've built here." Will pulled her close, her back against his chest, his arms wrapped around her waist as they watched the last light fade from the sky. "I'll never love him," he murmured against her hair, "and I need you to know that. There was someone before, someone who meant everything. But what I feel for you, Eleanor, it's different, deeper, like I've been walking through a dust storm my whole life, and you're the first clear breath I've taken." Eleanor quoted softly. The mail-order bride swore she'd never love him, remembering her own desperate promise on that stagecoach just weeks ago. She turned in his arms to face him, her hands framing his beloved face. Until the cowboy's kiss revealed he'd loved her in silence all along. Every moment, Will confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. From the time you stood in my yard, bruised and afraid, but still standing tall, I've loved you in silence, afraid to speak it. Afraid to hope. But I'm done being silent, Eleanor. I'm done being afraid. She kissed him then, pouring every ounce of love and gratitude and fierce joy into it. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, the first stars were emerging in the darkening sky. "Take me home, husband," Eleanor said, laughing at the wonder of calling him that. "Already there, wife," Will replied, and swept her into his arms, carrying her toward the cabin that would now be theirs, not because she needed rescuing, but because they'd chosen each other freely, completely, with eyes wide open to all the beautiful, terrifying possibilities that love brings. Behind them, the celebration continued, music and laughter carrying across the prairie. But Eleanor heard only Will's heartbeat against her cheek, steady and sure as the land itself, and she knew, bone deep and certain, that she'd finally found where she belonged, not in a place, but in the arms of a man who'd seen her at her most vulnerable and chosen to protect rather than possess, to love rather than control. A man who'd broken his own promises about never loving again, just as she'd broken hers. Together, they'd built something new from the ruins of their pasts, something strong and true and worth every risk, every moment of fear, every leap of faith. Together. That's what they'd be, now and always. 5 years later, Eleanor stood on the porch of the expanded ranch house, her hand resting on the swell of her belly. Their third child, due in the spring, the twins, Sarah and Caleb, named for the people who'd shaped Will's life, played in the yard under the watchful eye of their father, who was teaching them to gentle a new foal. The stone ranch had prospered under Will's careful management. They'd added another barn, expanded the herd, hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work. But more than that, they'd built a life filled with laughter and hard work, with storms weathered together and joy celebrated in equal measure. Will looked up from the corral, caught her watching, and smiled, that rare, unguarded smile he saved only for her. He said something to the children, then started toward the house with that easy, confident stride she'd fallen in love with watching. "You should be resting," he scolded gently when he reached her, one hand settling protectively over hers on her belly. "I was resting. Now I'm watching my family." Eleanor leaned into his warmth, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and prairie grass and home. "Besides, I'm not made of glass, Will Garrett. I'm a rancher's wife. We're tougher than we look." "Don't I know it?" He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Still the bravest person I've ever known. Still the best choice I ever made." "We made," Eleanor corrected. "We chose each other. Best choice we ever made then." Will's hand moved gently over her belly, and she felt their child kick in response, as if already eager to join this family built on trust and courage and love hard-won. "Together," Eleanor echoed, and kissed him as the prairie wind carried the sound of their children's laughter across land that would someday be theirs, a legacy of hope built from broken promises and second chances, of love discovered in the most unexpected place. The Wild West had a way of making you strong or breaking you entirely. Eleanor Hartwell Garrett had learned she was strong enough to stand, brave enough to love, and wise enough to recognize that sometimes the best promises were the ones you broke, the ones that kept you locked away from the life you were meant to live. And sometimes the greatest adventure wasn't escaping your past, but choosing to build your future with someone who saw all your scars and loved you not despite them, but because they'd shaped you into exactly who you were meant to be. The spring of 1876 arrived with torrential rains that turned the prairie into a sea of mud and tested every joint in the ranch buildings. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window of the main house, now truly her home, watching water cascade from the eaves while thunder rolled across the darkening sky. She'd been married to Will for 6 months, and each day brought new discoveries about the ranch, about survival on the frontier, and about the man she'd pledged her life to. Behind her, Will sat at the table cleaning his rifle, the familiar smell of gun oil mixing with the scent of the stew bubbling on the stove. It was a scene of domestic tranquility that still sometimes caught Eleanor by surprise. How quickly the extraordinary had become ordinary. How seamlessly her life had woven itself into his. "Storm's getting worse," Will observed, his voice carrying that particular note of concern she'd learned to recognize. "Creek'll be running high by morning. Might flood the south pasture if this keeps up." Eleanor turned from the window, studying her husband's profile in the lamplight. 6 months of marriage had taught her to read the subtle tensions in his jaw, the way his hands moved with extra precision when he was worried. "What does that mean for the horses?" "Need to move them to higher ground before the water rises." Will set down his cleaning rod, his green eyes meeting hers with quiet determination. "I'll ride out after supper, get them up to the North Ridge." "In this weather? Will, it's dangerous." "More dangerous to leave them where they are." He rose, crossing to her with that easy confidence she found both reassuring and occasionally infuriating. His hands settled on her shoulders, worn and solid. "I know this land, Eleanor. I've ridden through worse than a spring storm." She wanted to argue, to insist he wait until morning, but she'd learned something important in these months. Will Garrett wasn't reckless, but he was responsible to his bones. The horses were his livelihood and his passion. He'd no more leave them in danger than he'd abandon her. "Then I'm coming with you," she said firmly. Will's expression shifted to surprise, then concern. "Eleanor, you don't know how to. Then it's time I learned." She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with the same stubbornness that had carried her across 1,500 miles to this life. "You said I wasn't property, that I was a person. Well, this person is a rancher's wife, and it's time she learned to handle herself in situations like this. Teach me." For a long moment, Will studied her face, and Eleanor could see him weighing her safety against her pride, her determination against his protective instincts. Then, slowly, he smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his hard features into something approaching joy. "All right," he said, "but you do exactly as I say. No arguments, no hesitation. Understood?" "Understood." An hour later, Eleanor sat astride Clover, a gentle mare Will had chosen specifically for her, feeling the animal's warmth through the heavy oilcloth slicker Will had insisted she wear. The rain hammered down with relentless force, and lightning split the sky with increasing frequency. Beside her, Will sat easy on Thunder, his big black gelding, looking as natural in the saddle as most men looked in their parlor chairs. "We'll circle around from the east," Will shouted over the storm. "Drive them toward the North Ridge. Stay behind me, and if the lightning gets too close, we'll take shelter in the line shack. Your safety comes first, Eleanor, always." She nodded, gathering her reins the way he'd taught her during their evening lessons in the corral. Her heart hammered against her ribs, part fear, part exhilaration, as they rode out into the tempest. The horses were huddled in the south pasture when they arrived. 17 head of prime stock looking miserable and nervous as the thunder boomed overhead. The creek that bordered the pasture had already swollen to twice its normal width, the water running fast and dark with debris. "We need to move fast," Will called, already positioning Thunder to start the drive. "Just follow my lead and keep them moving forward. Don't let any break off from the group." What followed was the most terrifying and exhilarating hour of Eleanor's life. She learned what it meant to trust a horse beneath her, to read the movement of the herd, to position herself where Will indicated with nothing more than a gesture. Rain plastered her hair to her skull, ran in rivers down her back, despite the slicker. Lightning turned the world blue-white for heartbeat moments, and thunder shook her bones. But she didn't falter. They were halfway to the North Ridge when disaster struck. A massive lightning bolt hit a dead cottonwood not 50 yards away, the crack of impact deafening, the tree exploding in a shower of sparks and burning wood. The horses panicked, scattering in all directions, and Clover reared with a scream of terror. Eleanor felt herself sliding, grabbed for the saddle horn, missed. The ground rushed up to meet her, and then she was in the mud, gasping, Clover's hooves dangerously close to her head. "Eleanor!" Will's voice cut through the chaos. Then he was there, throwing himself from Thunder's back, positioning his body between her and the panicked mare. "Easy, girl, easy." His hands caught Clover's bridle, his voice steady and sure despite the storm. "Nobody's hurt. You're safe. Easy now." The mare calmed under his touch, her sides heaving. Will secured her reins quickly, then dropped to his knees beside Eleanor. His hands ran over her shoulders, her arms, checking for injury with professional efficiency, even as something wild flickered in his eyes. "Are you hurt? Eleanor, talk to me." "I'm fine," she managed, though her pride was more bruised than her body. "I'm sorry, I lost my seat. You did beautifully." Will's hands cupped her face, rain running between his fingers. "You stayed calm. You didn't panic. That's what matters. But we need to get you somewhere dry. The horses can wait until morning. Your health can't." "No." Eleanor pushed herself to sitting, ignoring the mud coating her from head to boot. "No, we finish this. You said yourself it's too dangerous to leave them. We're this close, Will. We finish it together." She watched him war with himself, saw the moment his respect for her determination won over his need to protect. "Together," he said finally, and helped her to her feet. They rounded up the scattered horses one by one, working in tandem with a coordination that felt almost telepathic. By the time they drove the last animal up onto the safety of the North Ridge, both were exhausted, soaked to the bone, and covered in mud. But the horses were safe. Will dismounted in front of the line shack, a small, sturdy cabin used during cattle drives, and helped Eleanor down with gentle hands. "Inside," he ordered, his voice rough with fatigue. "We'll wait out the worst of it here." The shack was basic but dry, with a pot-bellied stove and a pile of firewood stacked neatly in one corner. Will got a fire going with practiced efficiency, while Eleanor peeled off her sodden slicker, shivering in the sudden warmth. Will draped a wool blanket around her shoulders, his hands lingering briefly at her collarbone. "Sit close to the fire. I'll make coffee." Eleanor watched him move around the small space, noting the weariness in his movements, the way he favored his left side. "Will, are you hurt?" "Nothing serious. Got kicked when I was pulling in that roan stallion." He glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "You scared the hell out of me when you fell." "I know." Eleanor rose, crossing to him on unsteady legs. Her hands found his waist, and she felt him tense, then relax into her touch. But I didn't break. I got back up, because you taught me how. Will turned to face her, and in the firelight, his eyes held something fierce and tender all at once. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known," he said quietly. "Sarah Stone had courage, but you, Eleanor, you have courage and fire and a will that could move mountains. Do you have any idea what it does to me, watching you become more yourself every day?" "Show me," she whispered. The kiss was different from the gentle ones they'd shared before. Deeper, more urgent. Flavored with rain and relief and recognition of what they'd survived together. Eleanor's hands fisted in Will's wet shirt, pulling him closer, and she felt his control slip just enough to show her the depth of what he felt. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Will rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said, raw and honest. "Not because you're brave or strong or any of those things, though you are. I love you because you're you. Because when I'm with you, I'm more myself than I've ever been." "I love you too," Eleanor replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "My cowboy, my partner, my home." They stayed in the line shack until the storm passed, wrapped in blankets by the fire, talking softly about their dreams for the ranch, their hopes for the future. And when they finally rode back to the main house in the gray pre-dawn light, Eleanor knew something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't just Will's wife. She was his equal partner in building this life, this legacy. Together, that's what they'd always be. Summer arrived with brutal heat that baked the prairie hard as iron and turned the sky white with dust. Eleanor had learned to rise before dawn, to do the heavy work before the worst of the day's heat, had developed calluses on her hands from garden work and bread making, had grown lean and strong from the constant physical demands of ranch life. She'd also learned that being Will Garrett's wife meant more than sharing his bed and his table. It meant understanding the rhythm of the seasons, the needs of the animals, the delicate balance between preservation and risk that defined their livelihood. She'd become proficient with the household accounts, had taken over ordering supplies from town, had even learned to handle the old shotgun Will insisted she keep loaded near the door. "Just in case," he'd said, teaching her to shoot at tin cans lined up on the fence rail. "I need to know you can protect yourself when I'm out on the range." Eleanor had proven to be a surprisingly good shot, much to Will's visible pride and her own satisfaction. It was on a blazing afternoon in late July that their peaceful existence was shattered by the arrival of 3 riders, hard-looking men with trail dust coating their clothes and violence written in the way they sat their horses. Eleanor saw them from the garden where she was harvesting beans, felt her stomach drop with instinctive fear. Will emerged from the barn, his hand already resting casual-like on his gun as he approached the visitors. Eleanor couldn't hear the conversation from where she stood, but she could read the tension in Will's shoulders, the way he'd positioned himself between the strangers and the house, between them and her. The confrontation lasted perhaps 5 minutes before the riders turned and left. But Eleanor saw the way Will stood frozen in the yard, long after they disappeared over the rise. She dropped her basket and ran to him, her hands finding his arm. "Will, what did they want?" His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Blackwood Gang," he said finally, his voice rough. "Or what's left of it. They're planning a bank robbery in Redemption Flats next week." Wanted to know if I'd ride with them, for old time's sake. Eleanor felt ice slide through her veins. What did you tell them? No. Will's eyes met hers, and she saw the old ghosts there. Regret, shame, fear. Told them I'm not that man anymore. Haven't been for near a decade, but they didn't take it well. Said I'd better reconsider or there'd be consequences. What kind of consequences? Will's hand covered hers, squeezed gently. The kind that means you're not safe here alone anymore. Not until this is settled. The next 3 days passed in a state of controlled tension. Will taught Eleanor to shoot with deadly accuracy, made her practice drawing the shotgun quickly, rehearsed scenarios where she might need to defend herself. He also sent word to Marshal Tucker, explaining the situation, but the marshal was 3 days' ride away, dealing with trouble in another county. We're on our own until he gets back, Will said grimly. I need to ride into town, warn the bank, see if I can convince the sheriff to take this seriously. But that means leaving you here alone for most of a day. I can handle it, Eleanor said with more confidence than she felt. You've taught me well. I know you can. Will pulled her close, his arms tight around her. But that doesn't mean I like it. If anything happened to you because of my past, your past is part of who you are, Eleanor interrupted firmly. Part of what made you the man I love. We'll face it together, Will, just like we face everything. Will left at dawn the next morning. After making Eleanor promise to keep all the doors barred, the shotgun loaded, and Thunder, the smartest of their horses, saddled and ready in the barn, in case she needed to flee to the neighbor's ranch 5 miles south. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Eleanor threw herself into work, baking bread, mending clothes, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from imagining all the things that could go wrong. By mid-afternoon, she was strung tight as fence wire, jumping at every sound. That's when she heard the horses. 2 riders this time, approaching from the east where the sun would be in her eyes. Eleanor's heart hammered as she grabbed the shotgun, positioned herself by the front window where she could see, but remained partially concealed. The riders stopped, 30 yards from the house. One was from the group that had visited before. She recognized his gray horse and the scarred face beneath his hat brim. The other was younger, maybe 20, with a cruel twist to his mouth. Mrs. Garrett, the older one called. We know Will ain't here. Saw him riding toward town this morning. We just want to talk. Maybe convince you to put in a good word with your husband. Persuade him to see reason about helping with our business venture. Eleanor's hands tightened on the shotgun. Her mouth was dry, her pulse pounding in her ears, but her voice came out steady when she called back. My husband gave you his answer. We don't want trouble, but we won't be threatened on our own land. Leave now, and we'll say no more about this visit. The younger one laughed, harsh and mocking. Ain't she brave? Playing rancher's wife with a gun she probably don't even know how to use. I know how to use it just fine, Eleanor called, and fired a single barrel into the dirt, 3 feet in front of the gray horse. The animal shied violently, nearly unseating its rider, and both men's hands went to their guns. Next shot won't be a warning, Eleanor said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. I'm a good shot, and this is a big gun. At this distance, I won't miss. Now get off our land before I decide you're a threat that needs eliminating. For a long, tense moment, the men stared at the house. Then the older one gathered his reins, his expression dark with fury. Will Garrett's going to regret this. He's going to regret choosing you over his real family. We take care of our own, Mrs. Garrett, and we punish traitors. They rode off, but Eleanor didn't lower the gun until they disappeared completely. Only then did she allow herself to shake, to sink down on the floor with her back against the wall. Reaction hitting her in waves. She was still sitting there when Will rode in 2 hours later, the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon. He took one look at her face, at the discharged shotgun, and was on his knees beside her in an instant. "What happened? Eleanor, are you hurt?" She told him everything, watching his expression grow darker with each word. When she finished, Will pulled her into his arms so tight she could barely breathe. "I should have been here," he said against her hair, his voice rough with guilt and fury. "I should have—" "You were doing what needed to be done." Eleanor pulled back enough to meet his eyes. "And I did what needed to be done here. I protected our home, Will. I protected us. Because that's what we do. We protect each other, no matter what." Will cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gentle against her cheeks. "You are the most remarkable woman I've ever known," he said quietly. "And I swear to you, Eleanor, I'll end this. I'll make sure they never threaten you again." "We'll end this," she corrected. "Together." "Together," he echoed, and kissed her with a desperation that spoke of fear and pride and love too deep for words. The confrontation came 3 days later, not at the ranch, but in Redemption Flats. Marshal Tucker had returned, and armed with Will's information, had set up an ambush at the bank. When the Blackwood gang arrived to carry out their robbery, they rode straight into a trap. The gunfight was brief but violent. 2 of the gang members were killed, 3 captured, including the man who'd threatened Eleanor. Will hadn't fired a shot. Tucker had insisted he stay out of direct conflict to avoid any legal complications about his outlaw past. But he'd been there, standing with the law instead of against it, and everyone in town had seen it. That evening, as they rode home under a sky painted orange and purple by the setting sun, Eleanor reached across the distance between their horses and took Will's hand. "It's over," she said quietly. "Your past is truly behind you now. Everyone saw you stand with the marshal, saw you choose what's right." Will's fingers tightened around hers. "I chose what's right the day Sarah Stone found me bleeding in her yard and gave me a reason to change. I chose it again the day I offered you protection instead of advantage. And I choose it every morning when I wake up next to you and remember what I could have been if I'd kept making the wrong choices. You're a good man, Will Garrett, the best man I know." "I'm trying to be worthy of you," he said simply. "Trying to build something that matters, something that'll outlast both of us. This ranch, this life, it's our legacy, Eleanor, built on second chances and choices made right." Eleanor smiled, feeling the familiar warmth of gratitude and love bloom in her chest. "Then let's make it something worth remembering." They rode home together as the stars began to emerge. 2 people who'd found each other in desperation and built something beautiful from the broken pieces of their pasts. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, filled with possibility and promise, and Eleanor knew, bone deep and certain, that wherever this life led them, they'd face it side by side, together, always together. Autumn painted the prairie in shades of gold and russet, and with it came the first real test of Eleanor's commitment to ranch life. Will had negotiated a contract to sell 20 head of prime horses to the cavalry post in Fort Larned, a 3-day drive through difficult terrain, camping rough, and facing whatever dangers the trail might present. "I want to go with you," Eleanor announced over breakfast one morning in late September. Will paused with his coffee cup halfway to his lips, surprise flickering across his features. Eleanor, it's not a pleasure ride. 3 days on horseback, sleeping on the ground, minimal supplies. Not to mention the risks, weather, accidents, thieves looking for easy targets. I know. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. But I'm your partner in this ranch, Will. That means more than just cooking and keeping house. I want to understand every aspect of what we do, what we're building, and I want to prove to myself that I can handle it. She watched him consider, saw the moment his concern gave way to understanding. Will Garrett had always treated her as an equal, even when her own doubts had whispered she wasn't. He wouldn't start undermining her now. All right, he said finally. But we do this properly. You'll need practical clothes, a good saddle, supplies for the trail, and you'll follow my lead without question when it comes to safety. Agreed? Agreed. They left at dawn 3 days later, the horses strung out in a line behind them, their supplies packed on a sturdy pack mule Will had borrowed from their neighbor. Eleanor sat astride Clover, now as comfortable in the saddle as she'd once been in her Boston parlor, wearing borrowed trousers under her riding skirt and a wide-brimmed hat to shield her face from the relentless sun. The first day was grueling. They covered nearly 20 miles, stopping only briefly to water the horses and eat cold biscuits and jerky. By the time Will called a halt for the evening, Eleanor's legs trembled with exhaustion. Her back ached, and blisters had formed on her hands despite the gloves. But she didn't complain. Will made camp with efficient ease, unsaddling the horses, building a fire, setting up their bedrolls under a spreading cottonwood. Eleanor helped as best she could, learning the routine, pushing past her fatigue to pull her weight. How are you holding up? Will asked, as they sat by the fire after a simple dinner of beans and cornbread. Honestly, I hurt in places I didn't know could hurt. Eleanor smiled ruefully, stretching her sore shoulders. But I'm glad I came. Seeing what you do, understanding the work involved, it matters. It makes our success mean more. Will studied her face in the firelight, something soft and wondering in his expression. You never cease to amaze me. You know that? Most women would have demanded I turn back hours ago. I'm not most women. Eleanor shifted closer to him, seeking his warmth as the prairie night turned cold. I'm your wife, your partner. That means something to me, Will. It means everything. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her against his side. You're freezing, he murmured, feeling her shiver. Come here. Will arranged their bedrolls together, creating a shared space beneath the wool blankets. Eleanor curled against his chest, his warmth enveloping her, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For letting me be part of this. For treating me like I'm capable instead of fragile, for building this life with me instead of just giving me a place in yours. Will's arms tightened around her. Eleanor, you're not just part of my life. You are my life. Everything good, everything worth protecting, it all starts and ends with you. She tilted her head back to look at him, and in the dim light of the dying fire, his face held such raw honesty that it stole her breath. I love you, she said simply. I love the man you are, the man you're still becoming. I love this life we're building, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Will kissed her then, soft and deep, and Eleanor felt the last walls around her heart crumble completely. She'd spent so many years protecting herself, keeping everyone at arm's length, afraid of being hurt again. But with Will, she was learning that vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was the price of intimacy, of true partnership, of love that mattered. They held each other beneath the vast prairie sky, listening to the horses moving peacefully nearby, the distant howl of coyotes, the whisper of wind through grass. And Eleanor thought about how far she'd come from that frightened woman on a stagecoach, convinced she'd never love again. How wrong she'd been. How gloriously, wonderfully wrong. The second day brought unexpected complications. They were crossing a dry wash when one of the younger horses, a spirited paint mare, spooked at a rattlesnake and bolted. The sudden movement startled the others, and within seconds, half their string was scattering across the prairie. "Stay with the ones we've got," Will shouted, already wheeling thunder to give chase. "I'll get the runaways." But the paint mare was heading straight for a rocky outcropping where she could easily injure herself, and Will was too far away to intercept. Without thinking, Eleanor dug her heels into Clover's sides and took off after the runaway. She'd been riding regularly for months now, had developed an easy seat and good hands. But this was different. This was speed and risk and split-second decisions. The prairie blurred past, wind tearing at her hat, and ahead of her, the paint mare ran with wild-eyed terror toward disaster. "Come on, girl," Eleanor urged Clover. "We've got to reach her." They closed the distance gradually, foot by hard-won foot. 20 yards from the rocks, Eleanor drew alongside the paint. She leaned out, just like Will had taught her during their practice sessions, and grabbed the trailing lead rope. The paint fought, pulling hard, but Eleanor held on, using her weight and Clover's momentum to gradually turn the panicked horse away from danger. By the time she got the paint under control, both horses were lathered with sweat and blowing hard. Eleanor's arms trembled with the effort of holding the frightened mare, but triumph sang through her veins. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. Will appeared moments later, his face pale beneath his tan. He swung down from Thunder before the horse had fully stopped, reaching for Eleanor with hands that shook slightly. "Are you insane?" he demanded, his voice rough with fear. "You could have been thrown, trampled, killed, but I wasn't." Eleanor slid from Clover's back on legs that suddenly felt like water. "I saw what needed to be done, and I did it, just like you taught me." "Eleanor." Will pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. His heart hammered against her cheek, his whole body tense with reaction. "Don't ever scare me like that again. Please. I can handle anything this life throws at us, except losing you." She pulled back just enough to see his face, to read the genuine terror there. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to frighten you. But Will, I had to try. That mare was heading for disaster, and I knew I could reach her. You've taught me so much, made me so much stronger. I had to use that strength." Will cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gentle against her cheeks. "You're right," he said finally, though the words seemed dragged from somewhere deep. "You did exactly what needed doing, and you did it brilliantly. I'm proud of you, Eleanor. Terrified but proud." "I'll try not to terrify you too often," she promised with a small smile. "That would be appreciated." Will pressed a kiss to her forehead, then reluctantly released her. "Come on, we've got horses to round up and miles to cover before dark." They reached Fort Larned late on the third day, dusty and exhausted, but with all 20 horses accounted for and in good condition. The cavalry officer who inspected them was impressed, and his praise for the quality of Will's stock was genuine. "You've got a good eye for horseflesh, get it?" he said, counting out payment in gold coins. "We'll be needing more in the spring. You interested in another contract?" "Absolutely," Will replied, shaking the man's hand. "You'll have first pick of next year's foals." As they rode away from the fort, Eleanor felt a deep satisfaction settle over her. This was real. The money in Will's saddlebags, the promise of future business, the knowledge that their ranch was not just surviving, but thriving. They were building something lasting, something that mattered. That night, they stayed at a boarding house in the small town near the fort, a luxury after 3 nights on the trail. Eleanor soaked away the aches and dust in a hot bath, while Will saw to the horses, then joined him in their rented room for a simple but wonderful meal brought up by the landlady. "To successful ventures," Will said, raising his glass of whiskey in a toast. "To partnership," Eleanor countered, touching her water glass to his. "To doing hard things together and coming out stronger for it." Will's eyes held hers across the small table, warm with pride and love. "I couldn't have done this without you. The drive, yes, I've done dozens alone. But building something that matters, something beyond just survival, that's only possible because of you, Eleanor. Because you see possibilities where I see obstacles. Because you believe in us." "I believe in you," she corrected softly. "In the man you are, the rancher you're becoming. And yes, I believe in us, in what we can build together if we're brave enough to keep trying." Later, as they lay together in the narrow bed, Eleanor traced the old scars on Will's chest, remnants of the gunshot wounds that had nearly killed him all those years ago. Reminders of the life he'd left behind. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Giving up that life, choosing this harder path?" Will caught her hand, pressed a kiss to her palm. "Not for a single moment. That life was death in slow motion, Eleanor. Every day, a little darker, a little emptier. This, what we have, this is living. Real living, with someone who matters. Building something that'll outlast us both. No, I don't regret it. I thank God every day that Sarah Stone found me, and that you took a chance on a broken-down cowboy with more past than future." "You're not broken down," Eleanor said fiercely. "You're the strongest man I know, and you have so much future ahead of you, ahead of us." "Then let's make it count," Will murmured, pulling her close. "Let's build something extraordinary." And there, in a simple boarding house room in a town whose name they'd forget by morning, Eleanor and Will Garrett recommitted themselves to the life they were creating. One day, one choice, one shared dream at a time. Together, always together. Winter arrived early that year, bringing snow that blanketed the prairie in white silence and temperatures that plunged below zero for days at a time. Eleanor had never experienced cold like this, the kind that made your breath freeze in your lungs, that turned water to ice within minutes, that could kill a person caught unprepared. But she'd learned, adapted, grown tougher. She wore multiple layers of wool and flannel, lined her boots with rabbit fur Will had trapped, wrapped her face in scarves when she had to venture out to feed the chickens or gather eggs. The ranch work didn't stop for weather. Animals still needed tending, fires still needed maintaining, life still demanded attention. It was on a particularly brutal morning in late December that trouble found them again. Eleanor was in the barn, breaking ice from the water troughs, when she heard raised voices from outside. She straightened, instinctively reaching for the rifle Will insisted she keep nearby whenever she worked alone, and moved carefully to peer through the barn door. 2 riders had arrived, one an older man with silver hair and an expensive coat, The other, a younger version, clearly his son. Between them sat a fancy carriage bearing an official seal Eleanor didn't recognize. The older man was speaking with Will in the yard, his voice carrying despite the wind. "I don't care what arrangement you had with Caleb Stone. The land office records show clear ownership boundaries, and your north pasture is on my property. Has been for years. I'm prepared to be reasonable, Mr. Garrett, but that reasonableness has limits." Eleanor felt ice that had nothing to do with the weather slide through her veins. She emerged from the barn, rifle held loosely but ready, and approached the group. Will's face was carved from stone, his jaw tight with controlled anger. "This is my wife, Eleanor," he said as she joined him. "Eleanor, this is Marcus Thornton. He owns the big spread east of here. He's claiming our north pasture, the one with the spring, is actually on his land." Thornton's eyes swept over Eleanor with barely concealed disdain. "Mrs. Garrett, I'm sure your husband has explained the situation. This is a business matter, nothing for you to concern yourself with." "Anything that affects our ranch concerns me," Eleanor replied coolly, planting herself firmly beside Will. "What evidence do you have for this claim?" Thornton looked surprised that she'd spoken, then irritated. "The land office surveys from 1871 clearly show boundaries that were marked with wooden stakes long since rotted away," Will interrupted. "Caleb Stone paid for that land fair and square, has the deed to prove it. That spring has been part of the Stone Ranch for 15 years. Then Mr. Stone was mistaken about the boundaries." Thornton's voice hardened, or perhaps took advantage of unclear markers to expand his holdings. "Regardless, I have a court order being drawn up. You have until spring to vacate the north pasture and remove any improvements you've made." "That's our water source in summer," Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. "Without that spring, we can't sustain the horses through the dry months." "You're not just taking land, you're threatening our livelihood." "That's not my concern, Mrs. Garrett. I suggest you and your husband make other arrangements." Thornton gathered his reins, preparing to leave. "I'm not an unreasonable man. I'd be willing to purchase the entire property for a fair price, say half what Stone paid for it. Give you both a fresh start somewhere else." "We're not selling," Will said quietly, but Eleanor heard the steel beneath his words. "This is our home. We've built it with our own hands, made it what it is. We won't be forced out by a land grab disguised as a boundary dispute." Thornton's expression darkened. "I'm trying to be civilized about this, Garrett. But if you insist on making it difficult, I have resources you can match. Legal resources, financial resources, and friends in places that matter. You're just a former outlaw with a small spread and a mail-order bride. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." He rode off before either of them could respond, leaving Eleanor and Will standing in the snow-covered yard, their breath fogging in the freezing air. "Can he do this?" Eleanor asked once Thornton had disappeared. "Can he really take our land?" Will's expression was grim. If he's got the land office records on his side, and a judge willing to rule in his favor, then yes. Money and influence can buy a lot in this territory, Eleanor. Justice isn't always just. "Then we fight." Eleanor turned to face her husband, her voice firm despite the fear churning in her stomach. "We get our own survey done, find witnesses who can testify to the original boundaries, hire a lawyer if we have to. We don't just roll over and let him take what's ours." Will pulled her close, his arms tight around her. "That'll take money we don't have, legal fees, survey costs. It could drain everything we've saved, Eleanor. We could lose it all anyway and be left with nothing. Or we could win. Eleanor pulled back to meet his eyes. Will, you taught me something important these past months. You taught me that sometimes you have to risk everything for what matters. This ranch matters. Our life here matters. I won't give it up without a fight. A slow smile curved Will's hard mouth. My fierce wife, he murmured. What did I do to deserve you? You gave me a chance when I had nothing. You saw me as a person, not property. You built this life with me, not for me. Eleanor reached up to cup his cold, roughened cheek. Now it's time to protect what we've built. Together. Together, Will echoed, and kissed her with a desperation that spoke of love and fear and determination all mixed together. The next weeks were consumed with preparation for the legal battle ahead. Will rode to Redemption Flats to consult with a lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Adelaide Morrison, who'd moved west after her husband's death and made a name for herself defending homesteaders against land speculators. Your case is solid, Adelaide told them during her visit to the ranch in early January. Caleb Stone's original purchase documents are clear, and I've found 3 longtime residents willing to testify that the North Pasture has always been considered Stone property. But Thornton has influence with the territorial judge. This won't be easy. We don't need easy, Eleanor said. We just need fair. The hearing was set for March, which gave them 3 months to gather evidence, prepare testimony, and somehow continue running the ranch while their future hung in balance. The stress took its toll. Eleanor saw it in the tension around Will's eyes, the way he worked until exhaustion claimed him. The nights he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Talk to me, she said one particularly difficult evening, when Will had been silent through dinner and barely touched his food. Don't shut me out, Will. Whatever you're feeling, share it with me. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. I'm afraid, he finally admitted, the words rough as gravel. Afraid that I'll lose this place, this life. Afraid that I'll fail you, Eleanor. That all your faith in me, all your courage, it won't be enough because I'm not enough. Eleanor moved to kneel before him, taking his scarred hands in hers. Will Garrett, you listen to me. You are enough. You've always been enough. And whatever happens with this land dispute, we'll face it together. If we lose the ranch, we'll start over somewhere else. If we win, we'll build it even stronger. But no matter what, we have each other. That's what matters. That's what makes us unbreakable. Will pulled her into his lap, burying his face in her hair. I love you, he said, voice muffled. God, Eleanor, I love you so much it terrifies me sometimes. I love you too. Eleanor held him close, feeling his heart beat against hers. And we're going to win this fight, because we're right, and because we won't quit. Thornton thinks we're weak because we don't have his money or influence. But he doesn't understand what we do have, each other, our determination, and the truth on our side. My warrior woman, Will murmured, and kissed her with a tenderness that made Eleanor's heart ache. The hearing came in late March, held in the cramped courthouse in Redemption Flats, with Judge Harrison presiding. Marcus Thornton arrived with his high-priced lawyer, wearing expensive clothes and an expression of smug confidence. Eleanor and Will sat with Adelaide Morrison, Eleanor wearing her best dress and Will in the suit he bought for their wedding. The proceedings lasted 2 days. Thornton's lawyer presented land office documents, argued about unclear boundaries and honest mistakes. Adelaide countered with Caleb Stone's original deed, testimony from longtime residents, and evidence that Thornton had tried this same tactic with 2 other small ranchers in the past year. On the second day, Eleanor herself took the stand. "Mrs. Garrett," Thornton's lawyer said with barely concealed condescension, "you've only been in the territory for 9 months. Surely you can't claim any real knowledge of land boundaries or historical property lines." "You're right that I'm relatively new to the territory," Eleanor replied calmly, "but I can tell you what I know about the North Pasture and that spring. I know my husband and I have put our sweat and blood into maintaining it. I know we've used that water to keep our horses healthy and thriving. I know it was part of the property when Caleb Stone purchased it 15 years ago, and it remained part of the property when my husband took over its management." She leaned forward slightly, her voice strengthening. "And I know that Mr. Thornton didn't care about boundaries or surveys until he saw that our ranch was prospering. This isn't about correcting an honest mistake. This is about a powerful man trying to take what doesn't belong to him simply because he thinks he can. That's not justice. That's theft." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Thornton's face reddened with anger. "Mrs. Garrett," the lawyer began, but Adelaide cut him off. "No further questions, Your Honor. I think Mrs. Garrett has made the situation perfectly clear." Judge Harrison deliberated for 3 hours. When he finally returned to the courtroom, Eleanor felt Will's hand find hers beneath the table, their fingers interlacing tightly. "I've reviewed all the evidence presented," the judge said, his weathered face grave. "And I've come to a decision. The original boundary markers may indeed have been unclear, and the land office records show some ambiguity. However, 15 years of consistent use and maintenance establishes clear precedent. The North Pasture and Spring have been improved and cared for by the Stone Ranch, and Mr. Thornton made no claim to them until recently." He paused, his gaze moving between the parties. "I find in favor of the defendants. The North Pasture remains part of the Stone Ranch property. Mr. Thornton, your claim is denied. Court costs will be split between both parties." Eleanor felt Will's hand tighten almost painfully around hers, heard his sharp exhale of relief. They'd won. They'd actually won. Outside the courthouse, Adelaide shook their hands with a satisfied smile. "Good work in there, Eleanor. That speech about theft disguised as a boundary dispute, that's what turned the judge's opinion. He's an honest man who doesn't like seeing small ranchers pushed around." "Thank you," Eleanor said sincerely, "for everything. We couldn't have done this without you." "You could have," Adelaide corrected. "You just would have had a harder time. You two have something special, true partnership. That's rarer than you might think out here." As they rode home in the gathering twilight, Eleanor leaned against Will's side in the wagon seat, exhausted but triumphant. "We did it," she said softly. "We fought and we won." "You did it," Will corrected. "That testimony, Eleanor, you were magnificent. Fierce and articulate and absolutely fearless. Thornton never saw you coming." "We did it together," Eleanor insisted. "Just like we do everything. That's our strength, Will. Not in being separate, but in being united. When we stand together, we're unshakable." Will pulled the wagon to a stop, turning to face her fully. In the fading light, his green eyes held something profound and tender. "I want to give you everything," he said quietly. "I want to build you the finest house in the territory, fill it with beautiful things, give you a life of ease and comfort. I don't need those things." Eleanor reached up to trace the beloved lines of his face. "I need you. I need this life we're building, hard as it is. I need the satisfaction of working beside you, of overcoming challenges together, of knowing we've earned every bit of what we have. That's worth more than all the comfort in the world. I love you, Eleanor Garrett. With everything I am, everything I'll ever be, I love you. And I love you, she whispered back. My cowboy, my partner, my home. They kissed as the stars began to emerge overhead. Two people who'd wagered everything on each other and won more than they'd ever dreamed possible. The ranch waited for them, their land secure, their future bright with possibility. Together, that's what they'd always be. And together, they were unstoppable. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale from. Are you listening at home? During your commute? Or perhaps while working? Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. What did you think of Eleanor and Will's journey? Your feedback means the world to us.